There are people who walk through life carrying a different kind of weight. Not the weight of tragedy or misfortune, but the weight of seeing. They notice the tremor in a voice when someone says they're fine. They feel the shift in energy when truth hides behind polite smiles. They sense the unspoken longing in a room full of laughter. And in love, this gift becomes their greatest paradox. Because to love deeply when you see deeply is to stand at the edge of an impossible choice. Do you speak what you see, or do you protect the comfort of not knowing? Do you offer your full presence, or do you dim your light so others can stay asleep? Most people don't realize how lonely it is to love while awake. They think loneliness is about being physically alone, but there's a different kind of solitude that settles into the bones of those who perceive too much. It's the loneliness of sitting across from someone you adore, watching them perform a version of themselves they think you need to see, knowing that the truth of who they are is hiding just beneath the surface. It's loving someone so completely that you can feel their fear, their resistance, their walls, and having to make peace with the fact that they may never be ready to let you in. This is where the journey begins for the awakened soul in love. Not in the romance novels or the fairy tales, but in the quiet realization that consciousness changes everything. That once you've seen through the illusions most relationships are built upon, you can't unsee them. You can't pretend that surface-level connection satisfies you. You can't settle for conversations that never go beneath the weather and weekend plans. You can't ignore the performance, the masks, the carefully constructed personas people wear to avoid being truly known. And so you find yourself alone. Not always physically, but emotionally, spiritually. You find yourself in relationships that feel like standing in a room where everyone is speaking a language you once knew but have somehow outgrown. You reach for depth and find only the shallow end. You offer vulnerability and receive deflection. You ask questions that matter and watch people's eyes glaze over with discomfort. The awakened soul knows something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. They know that real love is not about finding someone who completes you or fills your emptiness or makes you feel whole. Real love is about meeting someone in the raw, unfiltered truth of existence. It's about standing together in the fire of transformation, not because it's comfortable, but because it's real. It's about seeing each other without the masks, without the stories, without the need to be anything other than what you are in this moment. But here's what makes this so difficult. Most people aren't ready for that kind of love. They say they want depth, but what they really want is depth that doesn't challenge them. They want intimacy, but only the kind that feels good. They want to be seen, but only the parts they've learned to accept. And when you show up offering something more, something that demands presence and honesty, and the courage to face what's been hidden, they retreat. Not because they don't care, but because awakening is terrifying. I once knew someone who described their relationship as living in two different worlds. They would lie in bed next to their partner, feeling the distance between them like an ocean. Not because they didn't love each other, but because one of them had started asking questions the other wasn't ready to hear. Questions like, who are we beneath these roles we play? What are we really afraid of? What would it mean to love each other without conditions, without the safety of familiar patterns, without the comfort of predictable endings? These questions didn't come from a place of judgment or superiority. They came from a genuine longing to connect at a level that felt true. But to the partner who wasn't ready, these questions felt like an attack. They felt like pressure. They felt like a demand to be something they didn't know how to be. And so, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance grew. Not with anger or conflict, but with the quiet resignation that comes when two people realize they're walking different paths. This is the paradox of the awakened soul in love. The more conscious you become, the more you long for connection that matches that consciousness. You don't want less than what you've discovered within yourself. You don't want to pretend that surface-level pleasantries are enough. You don't want to play the games that keep love safe and small and manageable. You want the kind of love that strips away everything false, that meets you in the tender, vulnerable spaces where transformation happens. But that kind of love is rare. Not because awakened people are rare, but because two people awakening at the same time in the same way, with the same willingness to walk through fire together, is a convergence that doesn't happen easily. And so, you wait. Not passively, but actively. You continue to grow, to deepen, to explore the vast landscape of your own consciousness, knowing that the loneliness is part of the path. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with this awareness. It's the grief of watching potential relationships fade before they begin, not because of incompatibility in the usual sense, but because the depth you're offering isn't something the other person can receive. You meet someone and feel that spark of recognition. You sense the possibility of something beautiful, and then, slowly, you watch them choose comfort over truth. You watch them retreat into familiar patterns. You watch them build walls where you were hoping to find doors. This grief is subtle but persistent. It shows up in small moments, when you share something vulnerable and watch their eyes glaze over with discomfort, when you ask a question that goes beneath the surface and they deflect with humor or change the subject. When you feel them pulling away, not because they don't care, but because your presence asks them to show up in ways they haven't learned yet. The awakened soul feels this withdrawal acutely because they've already done the work of dismantling their own defenses. They've sat with their shadows. They've faced their fears. They've learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, but the doorway to genuine connection. And they long for someone who's done the same work, who understands that real intimacy requires the courage to be seen in your entirety, not just the polished, acceptable parts. But most people are still hiding. Not maliciously, but habitually. They've spent years constructing elaborate systems of protection, convinced that if anyone saw who they really were, they'd be rejected. And when you show up offering acceptance without conditions, when you demonstrate through your presence that it's safe to be real, something unexpected happens. Instead of opening, they often retreat further, because your openness highlights their hiddenness. Your authenticity makes their masks feel heavier. Your depth reminds them of all the places they've learned not to go. This creates a peculiar dynamic. The more conscious you become, the more threatening your presence can be to those still operating from fear. Not because you're judgmental or superior, but because consciousness itself is a mirror. It reflects back what people have been avoiding. And most people, when confronted with that reflection, would rather step away than step closer. And the hardest part is that you understand why. You understand that awakening isn't something you can force or convince or inspire in someone who isn't ready. You understand that everyone is exactly where they need to be in their journey. You understand that your role isn't to save anyone, or fix anyone, or drag anyone into consciousness against their will. But understanding doesn't make it hurt less. Understanding doesn't fill the emptiness that comes from longing for a connection that meets you where you are. Some awakened souls respond to this loneliness by closing down. They decide that the risk of opening isn't worth the pain of rejection. They build their own walls, their own protections, their own reasons why love isn't for them. They tell themselves stories about being too evolved, too sensitive, too aware for ordinary relationships. And there's truth in this, but it's also a form of giving up. It's trading one kind of loneliness for another. Others keep trying, keep reaching, keep hoping that the next person will be different. They move from relationship to relationship, each time believing that this time they've found someone who can meet them in the depths. And each time they discover the same pattern. The initial connection, the hope, the gradual realization that the other person isn't ready, the slow retreat, the ending. And with each cycle, the question grows louder. Is there something wrong with me? Am I asking too much? Should I learn to be satisfied with less? These are painful questions because they come from a place of genuine self-doubt. When you find yourself consistently alone, despite your willingness to love, despite your openness, despite your capacity for depth, it's natural to wonder if the problem is you. Maybe you're too intense. Maybe you're too demanding. Maybe you need to lower your standards or adjust your expectations, or learn to appreciate the kind of love that's actually available, rather than holding out for some idealized version that doesn't exist. But here's what I've come to understand through years of watching awakened souls navigate this territory. The problem isn't that you're asking too much. The problem is that you're asking for something most people haven't learned to give. Not because they're broken or lacking or less than, but because consciousness unfolds at its own pace, because awakening isn't a destination but a continuous process. Because the journey from surface to depth isn't something that happens overnight. What the awakened soul in love must learn is patience, not the passive waiting that hopes for rescue, but the active patience that continues to grow and deepen and expand while remaining open to connection. It's the patience that doesn't close the heart as protection, but keeps it tender and available, even in the face of disappointment. It's the patience that understands that your readiness doesn't determine anyone else's timing. And this patience isn't about martyrdom or noble suffering. It's about recognizing a fundamental truth. Consciousness unfolds according to its own rhythm, not according to your preferences or timeline. You can't rush someone into awakening any more than you can force a flower to bloom before its season. All you can do is tend your own garden and trust that when the time is right, when two gardens are flourishing in their own fullness, they might find a way to grow together. There's a maturity that develops in this waiting, a kind of spiritual ripening that happens when you stop fighting against what is and start working with it. You begin to see that every relationship that didn't work out wasn't a failure but a teaching. Every person who couldn't meet you in depth was showing you something about your own capacity to stand alone. Every disappointment was an invitation to deepen your relationship with yourself. This perspective doesn't eliminate the pain, but it transforms it. Instead of feeling like a victim of circumstance, you begin to see yourself as a participant in your own becoming. The loneliness stops being something that's happening to you and starts being something you're moving through with purpose and awareness. And in that shift, you discover resources within yourself you didn't know existed. You learn to sit with discomfort without needing to fix it immediately. You develop the capacity to hold longing without letting it consume you. You discover that you can want partnership deeply while also being genuinely content in your own company. These aren't contradictions. They're the hallmarks of emotional and spiritual maturity. This is where the real spiritual work begins, because it's easy to be open and loving and available when you're meeting someone who matches your consciousness. The challenge is to remain open when you're not, to stay present in relationships that don't fulfill you completely without betraying yourself, to honor your need for depth while also honoring the reality of where others are. To hold space for different levels of awareness without judgment or resentment. I'm not suggesting you should settle for relationships that diminish you or require you to pretend you're less aware than you are. That's not patience, that's self-abandonment. What I'm pointing to is something more subtle. It's the ability to engage with love as a practice rather than a destination. To see each relationship, each connection, each interaction as an opportunity to bring consciousness into form, regardless of whether it becomes the grand love story you've been imagining. Because here's what most awakened souls eventually discover. The loneliness isn't actually about the absence of a partner. It's about the absence of resonance. It's about living in a world where most people are operating from a frequency you've outgrown, and the longing for someone who speaks your language, who sees what you see, who feels what you feel. And while that resonance is beautiful and nourishing when you find it, waiting for it to arrive before you can be fully alive is another form of sleep. The awakened soul in love must learn to be their own companion first. Not as a consolation prize for not finding partnership, but as the foundation from which real partnership becomes possible. Because the truth is, you can't truly meet another person in depth if you haven't learned to meet yourself there first. You can't offer presence if you're always looking outside yourself for validation. You can't create the kind of love that transforms if you're coming from a place of lack. This self-companionship is different from the self-sufficiency our culture often celebrates. It's not about being so independent that you don't need anyone. It's not about building walls so high that loneliness can't reach you. It's about developing such a rich inner life, such a deep relationship with your own consciousness, that being alone becomes a choice rather than a sentence. Think about what it means to truly be your own companion. It means you've learned to listen to yourself with the same attention you'd give to a beloved friend. It means you've developed the capacity to comfort yourself in moments of pain without bypassing the pain itself. It means you can celebrate your own growth without needing external validation. It means you've become fluent in the language of your own heart. This is hard work, harder, in many ways, than maintaining a relationship with another person. Because when you're alone with yourself, there's nowhere to hide. Every unresolved wound, every shadow you haven't faced, Every pattern you've been avoiding comes forward demanding attention, and the awakened soul doesn't turn away from this. They lean in, they sit with what's uncomfortable. They do the excavation work that most people outsource to relationships or distract themselves from entirely. And something remarkable happens in this process. The qualities you've been seeking in a partner, you begin to cultivate in yourself. You want someone who listens deeply. You learn to listen to yourself that way. You want someone who can hold space for your complexity. You practice holding space for your own contradictions. You want someone who loves you unconditionally. You begin offering that love to yourself, flaws and all. This isn't narcissism or self-absorption. It's the opposite. It's recognizing that you are the longest relationship you'll ever have, and it deserves the same care and attention you'd give to any partnership you value. It's understanding that the love you're seeking externally must first be established internally, or it will always feel like something you're chasing rather than something you're sharing. This is perhaps the most paradoxical teaching of all. The path to the love you're seeking requires you to stop seeking it. Not in the sense of giving up or becoming cynical, but in the sense of shifting your focus from finding to being, from searching for someone who can complete you to becoming so complete in yourself that partnership becomes an overflow rather than a need. When you're standing in that fullness, something shifts. You stop attracting relationships based on wounds and gaps and unconscious patterns. You stop choosing people who need fixing or saving or teaching. You stop settling for connections that require you to dim your light. And in that clarity, space opens for something different. Not because you've changed your standards or lowered your expectations, but because you've changed your frequency. There's a particular kind of person who shows up when you're living from this place. They're not perfect. They haven't transcended all their wounds, or completed their journey, or arrived at some final destination of enlightenment. But they're awake enough to recognize consciousness when they encounter it. They're courageous enough to choose depth over comfort. They're willing to walk into the fire of transformation rather than staying safe in familiar patterns. And when two people like this meet, something extraordinary becomes possible. Not because they complete each other or fix each other or make each other whole, but because they're both already whole enough to risk being broken open. They're both conscious enough to navigate conflict without abandoning themselves or each other. They're both awake enough to see through the illusions that destroy most relationships before they begin. This kind of love doesn't look like the fairy tales. It's not always easy or comfortable or safe. There are moments of profound difficulty, times when consciousness feels more like a burden than a gift. Times when you wish you could just go back to sleep, back to the simpler versions of love that don't demand so much presence and honesty and courage. But there's no going back. Once you've tasted the depth of real connection, surface-level relationships lose their appeal. The question then becomes, how do you live in the meantime? How do you navigate the space between awakening and finding partnership that matches that awakening? How do you stay open without becoming bitter? How do you maintain hope without falling into fantasy? The answer, I've found, lies in understanding that the journey itself is the destination. That every moment you spend deepening your own consciousness, exploring your own shadows, expanding your capacity for presence, you're preparing yourself for the love you seek. You're becoming the person who can sustain that kind of relationship. You're developing the skills and awareness and emotional maturity that real partnership requires. And in the process, you might discover something unexpected, that the loneliness you've been feeling isn't actually a problem to be solved. It's a teacher. It's showing you where you're still seeking validation outside yourself, where you're still believing that someone else can give you what only you can give yourself, where you're still confusing connection with completion. When you stop running from the loneliness and start listening to what it's teaching, it transforms. It becomes solitude instead of isolation. It becomes a rich, full space where you can hear your own voice clearly without the noise of others' expectations and projections. It becomes the ground from which authentic connection can grow. This doesn't mean you stop desiring partnership. The longing for deep connection is natural and beautiful and human, but it stops controlling you. It stops determining your worth or your happiness or your sense of wholeness. And in that freedom, you discover that you were never actually alone. You were just waiting to recognize the profound company of your own awakened presence. There are moments, usually in the quiet hours before dawn or late at night when the world has gone still, when the awakened soul feels the full weight of their solitude, not with drama or self-pity, but with a kind of tender recognition. This is the path I've chosen. This is the price of consciousness. This is what it means to refuse to go back to sleep. And in those moments, if you're paying attention, something else emerges, a deeper kind of love than you've been seeking. Not the love that comes from another person, but the love that you are. The love that doesn't need an object or recipient to be real. The love that flows through you simply because you're alive and awake and present to the mystery of existence. This is what the mystics have been pointing to for centuries. This is what Merton understood when he spoke of the true self. That beneath all the layers of conditioning and wounding and story, there's a presence that's already whole, already complete, already connected to everything. And when you touch that presence, when you learn to live from that place, the question of whether you're alone in love becomes irrelevant. Because you're not alone, you've never been alone. You've just been looking for yourself in the eyes of another, when all along you were right here, waiting to be recognized. Does this mean partnership doesn't matter? That awakened souls should give up on finding love and just learn to be content in solitude? Not at all. Partnership still matters. Connection still matters. The longing for someone who sees you and meets you and walks beside you through the fire of transformation is valid and real and worth honoring, but it changes the way you approach relationship. You stop looking for someone to complete you and start looking for someone to accompany you. You stop seeking validation and start seeking partnership. You stop trying to fill emptiness and start celebrating fullness together. And in that shift, the kind of love you're capable of offering and receiving expands beyond anything you imagined. The awakened soul in love eventually learns that their loneliness isn't a flaw or failure or sign that something's wrong with them. It's an invitation to go deeper, to expand further, to love more fully, starting with themselves. And when they accept that invitation, when they stop resisting the solitude and start embracing it as part of their path, something miraculous happens. They become magnetic in a completely different way, not because they're trying to attract anyone or playing games or pretending to be something they're not, but because they're finally, fully, unapologetically themselves. And that authenticity, that groundedness, that radical self-acceptance creates a frequency that can only be matched by someone who's done their own work, someone who's walked their own path, someone who's learned to love themselves first. And when two people like that meet, there's no need for games or strategies or carefully constructed personas. There's just recognition, a quiet knowing that says, I see you, I know you, I've been where you've been, I've felt what you've felt. I understand. That's the love worth waiting for. That's the partnership worth holding space for. Not because it's perfect or easy or always comfortable, but because it's real, because it's built on consciousness rather than neediness, because it honors depth rather than avoiding it, because it creates space for both people to continue growing and awakening and transforming without having to diminish themselves to maintain the relationship. This is what the awakened soul in love is really searching for. Not someone to complete them, but someone to expand with. Not someone to fix them, but someone to grow alongside. Not someone to make them feel whole, but someone who's already whole enough to create something greater than either of them could create alone. And if that takes time to find, if that requires patience and solitude and the willingness to keep choosing consciousness even when it's lonely, so be it. Because the alternative, settling for a relationship that requires you to go back to sleep, is no longer an option. Once you've awakened, once you've tasted the depth and richness and profound beauty of living consciously, there's no going back. The awakened soul in love learns to hold this paradox with grace, to remain open while being patient, to honor their needs while accepting reality, to long for partnership while being complete in themselves, to feel the loneliness without letting it become a story about their worth or their future or their capacity for love. And in that space of paradox, something extraordinary becomes possible. Not the fairy tale ending, or the perfect relationship, or the soulmate who arrives to rescue them from solitude, but something more real, more grounded, more sustainable, a love that's built on consciousness, a partnership that's rooted in truth, a connection that doesn't require either person to abandon themselves to maintain it. This is the love that's possible for awakened souls. Not easier than conventional love, but deeper. Not more comfortable, but more real. Not free from challenges, but conscious enough to navigate them without destroying what's been built. And until that love arrives, the awakened soul learns to walk alone with dignity and grace, to cherish their solitude rather than resent it, to see their sensitivity and awareness and depth not as burdens but as gifts, to trust that their path, however lonely it sometimes feels, is leading them exactly where they need to go. In the end, this is what it means to be an awakened soul in love. To carry the paradox of deep longing and deep contentment simultaneously, to remain open to connection while being complete in yourself, to honor your need for partnership while not making it the condition for your happiness. To keep choosing consciousness, keep choosing truth, keep choosing depth even when it means walking alone for a while, because you understand something most people never learn, that real love doesn't diminish consciousness, it expands it. That true partnership doesn't require you to go back to sleep, it invites you to awaken more fully. That the right person won't ask you to dim your light, they'll celebrate it, mirror it, dance with it in the sacred fire of transformation. And that love, when it comes, will have been worth every moment of solitude that preceded it, every lonely night, every disappointment, every time you chose truth over comfort, depth over ease, consciousness over sleep, because you'll finally understand that you weren't just waiting for love. You were preparing for it, becoming ready for it, growing into the person who could sustain it. This is the path of the awakened soul in love, not a path of resignation or bitterness or giving up, but a path of deepening, of expanding, of learning to love so fully, so consciously, so courageously, that when the right person arrives, you're ready. Not perfect, but present. Not complete, but whole. Not without wounds, but conscious enough to heal them together. And until then you walk, one step at a time, one breath at a time, one moment of consciousness at a time, alone but not lonely, waiting but not passive, open but not desperate, trusting that the same consciousness that brought you this far will guide you home.